It started like any other day in the sprawling, unforgiving world behind concrete walls and razor wire fences. The prison yard buzzed with its usual mix of tension and routine. Inmates shuffled around in clusters, some working out, others talking in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously around. This wasn't just any prison. It was one of the most notorious maximum security facilities in the country, where the worst of the worst was sent. It was a place where survival depended on alliances, intimidation, or brute strength. But today, the uneasy balance in this volatile ecosystem was about to shift. Among the inmates was a man named Marcus, a quiet, unassuming black man who had only recently been transferred here. He walked with a certain calmness, his demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. Marcus kept to himself, avoiding eye contact and trouble, his every move measured and deliberate. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about him, just another man trying to do his time and make it through the day. But if anyone had looked closer, if they had taken the time to study the way he carried himself, they might have noticed something different. Marcus's presence was almost too calm for a place like this. He didn't flinch at the threats thrown his way or the subtle posturing from the more aggressive inmates. He didn't rush to align himself with any gang or seek protection, a choice that most newcomers didn't have the luxury to make. To the others, this was seen as either foolishness or arrogance, and in a place where respect and power dictated survival, it was only a matter of time before someone decided to test him. The rumors started circulating almost as soon as Marcus arrived. Whispers about his past, whispers he never confirmed or denied. Some said he was framed for a crime he didn't commit, while others claimed he'd been a soldier before landing here. But there were no details, no solid facts, and the mystery only fueled the curiosity of those around him. To the prison gangs, Marcus was an enigma. A blank slate they were determined to fill with fear or violence. And for one gang in particular, the Aryan Vipers, Marcus's quiet confidence was an insult they couldn't ignore. The Vipers had ruled this prison for years, their influence extending to nearly every corner of the facility. They thrived on control, on making examples of anyone who dared challenge their authority. When Marcus refused to bow to their intimidation tactics, they saw it as a direct challenge. It didn't matter to them whether Marcus was innocent or guilty, whether he was dangerous or harmless. All that mattered was that he wasn't playing by their rules. The decision was made quickly and without hesitation. Marcus was marked as a target, and the Vipers planned to send a message, a brutal, unforgettable warning to anyone else who might think they could defy them. The leader of the gang, a hulking man named Travis, gave the order himself. Travis was known for his ruthlessness, a man who thrived on fear and domination. He made it clear that Marcus wasn't just to be beaten, he was to be humiliated, broken, left as a symbol of the Vipers' unyielding power. That afternoon, as the sun beat down on the prison yard, the tension in the air was almost palpable. Marcus was sitting alone at a weathered concrete table, his eyes scanning the yard, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing around him. But he wasn't unaware, not even close. He noticed the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the way conversations grew quieter when he passed, the sideways glances, the sudden clustering of certain groups. Marcus had been watching, listening, and calculating since the moment he arrived. He wasn't just a man serving time. He was a man with a past that would have shocked everyone in that yard had they known the truth. The Vipers made their move quickly, surrounding Marcus before he even had a chance to stand. Or at least, that's what they thought. Tragus stepped forward first, his towering frame casting a long shadow over Marcus. "You're in the wrong place, new guy," Travis growled, his voice low and menacing. "Time to learn how things work around here." The yard seemed to hold its breath. Inmates stopped what they were doing, their eyes glued to the unfolding scene. Fights were nothing new in this place, but there was something about this moment, something about the quiet man sitting there, unflinching, even as the gang closed in around him, that made it impossible to look away. Marcus finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't speak, didn't argue or beg. He simply looked at Travis, his expression unreadable. It was the kind of look that made even the most hardened criminals uneasy, a look that hinted at depths no one could see or understand. Travis took a step closer, his hand tightening into a fist. "You think you're tough, think you're smarter than us," he sneered. "You're gonna find out real quick who runs this place." What happened next was so fast, so unexpected, that most people didn't even see it. One moment, Travis was standing there, towering over Marcus, ready to strike. The next, he was on the ground, gasping for air, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The other vipers froze, their confidence evaporating as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Marcus didn't stop there. With a precision and speed that defied belief, he dismantled the gang's attack as if it were nothing more than a poorly choreographed routine. Every move was deliberate, every strike efficient. It wasn't flashy or brutal. It was controlled, calculated, the work of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of combat. When it was over, Marcus stood alone in the middle of the yard, his expression as calm as it had been at the beginning. Around him, the vipers lay scattered, groaning in pain, their dominance shattered in mere seconds. The yard was silent, the other inmates too stunned to speak. No one could believe what they had just seen. And then, just as the guards began to descend on the scene, someone whispered, "Who is this guy?" The truth was, Marcus wasn't just anyone. He wasn't some unlucky man who had stumbled into this hellhole by chance. Before his life had taken an unexpected turn, Marcus had been a legend, a highly skilled operative in the Delta Force, one of the most elite and secretive military units in the world. He had spent years in the shadows, completing missions that most people couldn't even imagine, his every action shrouded in secrecy. He was a ghost, a weapon, a man trained to survive and thrive in the most dangerous situations imaginable. But none of that mattered here. To the world outside, Marcus was just another inmate, another statistic in a broken system. And as the guards dragged him away, the other prisoners watched in awe and fear, their minds racing with questions. Who was this man? What had brought him here? And most importantly, what was he truly capable of? For Marcus, the fight with the vipers was just the beginning. He had tried to keep a low profile, to blend in and serve his time quietly. But now there was no going back. The balance of power in the prison had shifted, and Marcus was at the center of it. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly understand, was that this quiet, unassuming man wasn't just a survivor. He was a predator, a force of nature, and anyone who underestimated him was making a dangerous mistake. And as Marcus was led away, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossed his face. He had been tested, and he had passed. But he also knew that this was far from over. The vipers wouldn't let this go, and neither would the other gangs. They would come for him again, and next time, they would be smarter, more prepared. But Marcus wasn't worried. He had spent his entire life preparing for moments like this, and he knew one thing for certain. In a place like this, strength wasn't just about muscle or numbers. It was about the mind, about strategy, about knowing your enemy better than they knew themselves. And Marcus had spent years mastering those skills. Marcus sat in the solitary confinement cell, the dim light barely illuminating the cold, grey walls. The muffled sounds of the prison echoed faintly in the distance, gates clanging, guards shouting, inmates murmuring in low voices. He rested his head against the wall, eyes closed, steadying his breathing. It wasn't the first time he'd been in a situation like this, isolated and waiting for the next move. He had learned long ago that patience was a weapon as sharp as any blade. The guards had kept him there for hours, likely trying to piece together what had happened in the yard. They weren't used to seeing a single man take down a gang like the Vipers, especially not with such efficiency. But Marcus wasn't concerned about them. They were a predictable variable, an annoyance at worst. What truly held his attention was the brewing storm he knew was coming. Word traveled fast in a prison, faster than anyone might think. By now, every inmate in the facility would know about the incident. They'd know Marcus wasn't someone to be trifled with. Some would leave him alone, recognizing that he was dangerous in ways they couldn't understand. But others, like the Vipers, would see him as a threat, a problem that needed to be eliminated. And Marcus knew that the Vipers wouldn't stop until they tried again. This time, they wouldn't come at him blindly. They'd plan, regroup, and strike when they thought the odds were in their favor. He thought back to Travis, the gang leader. Marcus had seen men like him before, men who thrived on control, who built their power by preying on fear and weakness. Travis had been so sure of his dominance, so certain that Marcus was just another pawn to crush under his boot. But arrogance was always a weakness, and Travis had underestimated the man sitting in front of him. That mistake had cost him, and it would cost him even more if he made it again. Marcus opened his eyes, staring at the small, barred window at the top of the wall. The faint light filtering through reminded him of a different time, a different place. He let his mind drift back, the memories coming unbidden. Before all this, before the trial, before the conviction, before the prison, Marcus had lived a life most people couldn't comprehend. He had been recruited into the military at a young age, his natural talent for strategy and combat quickly setting him apart. He didn't talk much about his past, not even to the few people he had been close to, but those who knew him understood that Marcus wasn't just a soldier. He was something else entirely. Delta Force wasn't like other military units. It wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about precision, discipline, and operating in the shadows. Marcus had spent years training, pushing himself to the limits of his physical and mental endurance. He had been deployed on missions that didn't exist on paper, missions where failure wasn't an option. He had worked in the most dangerous environments in the world, dismantling threats before they could reach innocent lives. And through it all, he had remained invisible, a ghost. But that life had come with a cost. The missions, the secrecy, the constant danger, it had all taken a toll. Marcus had seen and done things that most people couldn't imagine, things that haunted him in quiet moments. He had learned to compartmentalize, to push the memories aside when they threatened to overwhelm him. But sometimes, like now, they crept back in, unbidden and unrelenting. He remembered one mission in particular years ago, in a foreign country whose name he couldn't say out loud. The team had been tasked with extracting a hostage from a heavily fortified compound. The operation had gone smoothly, too smoothly. Marcus had sensed it almost immediately, that feeling in his gut that told him something wasn't right. He had ordered his team to fall back, trusting his instincts over the plan. Minutes later, the compound had exploded, a trap meant to eliminate anyone who dared to enter. That mission had cemented Marcus's reputation as a leader who could see beyond the obvious, who could anticipate moves before they were made. But it had also taught him a painful lesson. No plan was perfect, and no one was invincible. He carried that lesson with him every day, a reminder that even the best could fall if they weren't careful. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled Marcus back to the present. He straightened, his senses sharpening as the door to his cell creaked open. A guard stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're being moved," the guard said gruffly. "Let's go." Marcus stood without a word, his movements deliberate. He followed the guard down the dimly lit corridor, his mind racing. Being moved could mean a lot of things in a place like this. It could mean isolation, a transfer to another wing, or something worse. But Marcus kept his face neutral, unwilling to show even a flicker of uncertainty. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence between them broken only by the rhythmic echo of their footsteps. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the corridor. The guard unlocked it and motioned for Marcus to step inside. The room was small, barely larger than a closet. A metal table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant. Seated at the table was a man Marcus hadn't seen before, dressed in a suit that seemed out of place in the stark, utilitarian environment of the prison. The man looked up as Marcus entered, his sharp eyes studying him with a mix of curiosity and intensity. "Sit," the man said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying. He lowered himself into the chair, his posture relaxed but alert. The man across from him leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Do you know who I am?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. Marcus shook his head. "Should I?" The man smiled faintly. "Probably not. But I know who you are, Marcus, and I know you're not supposed to be here." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his mind was racing. The man's tone wasn't accusatory, it was almost knowing, as if he was speaking to an equal, someone who understood the weight of secrets and shadows. "You've got my attention," Marcus said finally. "What do you want?" The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Marcus's. "Let's just say I have an interest in keeping tabs on people like you. People with unique skills." Marcus' eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't like the direction this conversation was heading. He had spent years burying his past, ensuring that no one could connect the man he was now to the man he had been then. And yet, here was this stranger, sitting across from him, casually referencing things that no one in this prison should have known. "Whatever you think you know," Marcus said quietly, "you're mistaken." The man chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "I don't think I'm mistaken, Marcus. In fact, I'd bet my career on it." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But don't worry. I'm not here to expose you. I'm here to make you an offer." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "An offer?" The man nodded. "You don't belong here. You know it, and I know it. But getting you out, legitimately, anyway, takes time. In the meantime, you're in a precarious position. You've already made enemies, and the Vipers aren't the forgiving type. If you're going to survive this, you're going to need some assistance." Marcus studied the man carefully, searching for any sign of deception. He didn't trust him. Trust wasn't something he gave easily, if at all, but there was something about the man's demeanor that suggested he wasn't lying. "What kind of assistance?" Marcus asked cautiously. The man smiled faintly. "Let's just say I have resources. People on the inside who can make sure you stay protected. But in return, I might need a favor or two down the line." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He had spent his life avoiding entanglements, knowing that favors often came with strings attached. But this wasn't just about him anymore. The incident with the Vipers had painted a target on his back, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they struck again. "I'll think about it," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. The man nodded, seemingly satisfied with the response. "That's all I ask." He stood, straightening his suit jacket. "You're an interesting man, Marcus. I look forward to seeing how this plays out." With that, the man walked out of the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. The door closed behind him, and Marcus sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling over him. He didn't know who the man was or what his true motives were, but one thing was certain: the game had changed. Marcus wasn't just another inmate anymore. He was a player in a much larger, much more dangerous game. And as the pieces began to move, he knew that every decision he made from this point forward would have consequences. Consequences that could mean the difference between survival and defeat. The air in the prison yard felt different after Marcus's confrontation with the Vipers. It wasn't just the bruised and beaten gang members that people noticed, it was the man who had done it. Whispers circulated in every corner, quiet and cautious, as though saying too much might draw Marcus' attention. Some called him crazy for standing up to the most powerful gang in the facility, while others believed he might be untouchable. But no one knew the truth. No one knew the history that shaped him into the quiet, calculating man walking through the chaos as if it didn't exist. Marcus wasn't interested in the rumors, though he was well aware of them. He could feel the eyes on him, the hushed voices stopping the moment he passed. It wasn't new. He had lived his life on the fringes, existing in places where trust was a luxury and survival was a skill. But even for someone like him, the pressure in the prison was unlike anything else. Here, everyone had something to prove, something to protect, and the hierarchy was built on fragile, dangerous ground. The Vipers, though licking their wounds, were far from done. Travis, their leader, was angrier than ever. His pride had been shattered, and in a place like this, humiliation was a debt that demanded repayment. He sat with his closest lieutenants in the shadows of the rec hall, his voice low but seething as he laid out his plan. They wouldn't come at Marcus directly again, not yet. The first attempt had taught them to be careful. This time, they would strike where it hurt most, where Marcus couldn't predict or defend. What they didn't know was that Marcus was always watching, always listening. He had noticed the subtle shifts in the Vipers' behavior, the way their glances lingered on him a fraction too long. He could feel a tension building, like the air before a storm. It was something he had been trained to sense, to understand. It wasn't just instinct, it was survival. Meanwhile, the strange man in the suit hadn't been seen again, though his words lingered in Marcus's mind. The offer of help had been tempting, but Marcus wasn't the type to accept anything without understanding the cost. He had spent his life avoiding entanglements, knowing they could pull you under faster than the dangers you were running from. But in this place, with enemies closing in, the man's proposal sat in the back of his mind, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The guards, too, had taken notice of Marcus after the fight. While they had officially punished him with solitary confinement, there was an undercurrent of curiosity in the way they looked at him. The guards were used to seeing violence, but what Marcus had done wasn't ordinary. It was precise, controlled, something that suggested training far beyond what anyone in this prison had. Officer Daniels, one of the more seasoned guards, had been quietly observing Marcus since his arrival. Daniels had seen all kinds of men pass through the prison, killers, thieves, con artists, but Marcus didn't fit any of the usual molds. There was something different about him, something that Daniels couldn't quite place. In the weeks that followed, the tension between Marcus and the Vipers simmered just beneath the surface. Marcus knew they were planning something, and he wasn't naive enough to think they'd let things go. But he also knew that reacting too soon would only make him vulnerable. He needed to wait, to let them show their hand first. It wasn't easy, though. The prison was a pressure cooker, every day pushing him closer to the edge. To keep himself grounded, Marcus fell into a routine. He exercised in the yard, keeping his body sharp, and spent his evenings reading in the dim light of his cell. The books were old and worn, but they provided an escape, a brief reprieve from the weight of his surroundings. He often thought about his past during those quiet moments, about the choices that had led him here. There were pieces of the story that didn't add up, questions that gnawed at him in the dead of night. Marcus wasn't a stranger to betrayal, but the events that had landed him in prison was still a tangled web in his mind. Someone had set him up, of that he was sure, but the why and the who remained elusive. One evening, as Marcus sat on the edge of his bunk, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. It wasn't unusual to hear movement at night, but something about these footsteps was different, deliberate, measured. They stopped just outside his cell, and Marcus looked up to see a figure standing in the shadows. It wasn't a guard. The figure stepped closer, and Marcus recognized him as one of the newer inmates, a man named Lewis. Lewis was small and wiry, with quick eyes that darted nervously around as he spoke in a low voice. "They're watching you," he said, glancing over his shoulder. Marcus didn't react immediately. He had seen Lewis around before, but they had never spoken. "Who's watching me?" he asked, his tone calm. Lewis hesitated, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "The Vipers. And someone else. I don't know who, but they're asking questions about you. Quiet-like." Marcus studied the man carefully. Lewis didn't seem like the type to get involved in prison politics, which made his presence here all the more curious. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. Lewis shifted nervously. "Let's just say, I've got my reasons. The Vipers don't take kindly to people like me. I figure if they're focused on you, maybe they'll leave me alone." Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't entirely trust Lewis, but the information wasn't surprising. The Vipers were playing a longer game now, one that involved more than brute force, and the mention of someone else asking questions, that was new. After Lewis left, Marcus sat in the darkness, piecing together what little he knew. The Vipers were plotting, the guards were watching, and now there was another player in the mix. It was too much to be coincidence. Someone somewhere was pulling strings, and Marcus was caught in the middle of it. The next day, Marcus noticed something unusual in the yard. Travis and his crew weren't in their usual spot. Instead, they were scattered, blending into the crowd in a way that seemed almost deliberate. It wasn't like them to lay low, which only made Marcus more suspicious. As he moved through the yard, he caught glimpses of their eyes on him, tracking his movements. They were waiting for something, biding their time. But Marcus wasn't the only one who noticed the shift. Other inmates, sensing the undercurrent of danger, kept their distance from him. The yard felt different, tense, charged. It was a reminder that in a place like this, alliances and rivalries could change in an instant. That night, Marcus lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He knew the storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. But he also knew that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about strategy, about being one step ahead. And if there was one thing Marcus had learned in his years with Delta Force, it was how to adapt, how to outthink and outmaneuver even the most dangerous enemies. As the prison settled into its uneasy silence, Marcus closed his eyes, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what the next move would be, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't be caught off guard, not again. The days that followed felt like the calm before a storm, but Marcus knew better than to trust the quiet. Every corner of the prison carried an air of unease. The Vipers were still scattered, their usual bravado replaced with an eerie patience that kept Marcus on high alert. Their absence from the yard and mess hall wasn't a retreat, it was a strategy. Marcus had seen this kind of tactic before. They were setting the stage, creating a false sense of calm, and waiting for the right moment to strike. In the meantime, Marcus kept to himself, his movements calculated and deliberate. He knew the key to staying ahead was to remain unpredictable. He avoided any clear routines, moving at different times and in different patterns each day. He kept his senses sharp, always scanning his surroundings, noticing even the smallest details. Every glance, every whisper, every shadow became a potential clue. The prison's walls might have confined him, but Marcus's mind was a weapon that no one could cage. One night, while the prison was bathed in darkness and silence, Marcus was jolted awake by a faint noise outside his cell. It was soft, barely more than a scrape, but it was enough to put him on edge. He lay perfectly still, his breathing steady as he listened. A shadow moved just beyond the bars of his cell, and for a split second, he thought he saw a figure pass by. But then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The next morning, Marcus noticed something unusual when he walked into the yard. A small folded piece of paper was tucked beneath the bench he often used for his workouts. He casually retrieved it, careful not to draw attention, and slipped it into his pocket. Later, in the privacy of his cell, he unfolded the paper to find a single sentence written in jagged, hurried handwriting. "They're coming for you tonight." Marcus stared at the note, his expression unreadable. He didn't know who had left it or why, but the message didn't surprise him. He had been expecting the Vipers to make their move eventually, and now he had a timeline. But what unsettled him wasn't the threat, it was the timing. Why tonight? What had changed? The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Marcus spent the day preparing, though to an outside observer, he appeared calm and indifferent. He worked out in the yard, kept his head down during meals, and avoided unnecessary interactions. But in his mind, he was running through every possible scenario, every potential angle the Vipers might take. He thought about the layout of the cell block, the guard rotations, the blind spots in the security cameras. If they were coming for him, he would be ready. As night fell, the prison settled into an uneasy stillness. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the background, and the occasional clank of a metal door echoed through the halls. Marcus sat on the edge of his bunk, his muscles tense, but his mind clear. He didn't know who had left in the note, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that it might be a trap, an attempt to make him lower his guard. Still, he had no intention of being caught off guard. The hours ticked by, and just as Marcus began to wonder if the note had been a false alarm, he heard it, a faint shuffling sound, barely audible over the stillness. His eyes flicked to the cell door, and he saw movement in the shadows. The first figure appeared, then another, and then a third. They moved silently, their faces obscured by the darkness, but Marcus recognized the shapes immediately. The Vipers had come. They weren't subtle about their intentions. One of them, a hulking man Marcus recognized as Travis' enforcer, held a sharpened piece of metal in his hand. The others carried similar improvised weapons, shears made from toothbrushes and razors, the tools of desperation and violence. Marcus remained seated, his posture deceptively relaxed as the men approached. The cell door creaked open, and the three figures stepped inside, their movements slow and deliberate. Marcus didn't flinch, his eyes locked on the leader, who stood just a few feet away. Travis wasn't with them, which didn't surprise Marcus. A leader like Travis rarely dirtied his hands directly, but it didn't matter. Marcus knew the drill. The leader would send his men in first, testing the waters, while he waited safely on the sidelines. "You should have stayed in your lane," the enforcer said, his voice low and menacing. "But now you've got nowhere to run." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he let them make the first move, knowing that overconfidence would be their downfall. The first man lunged, his weapon aimed at Marcus's chest, but Marcus was faster. He sidestepped the attack with a fluid motion, his hand lashing out to grab the man's wrist. With a quick, practiced twist, he disarmed him, the makeshift shiv clattering to the ground. The second man was on him in an instant, swinging wildly, but Marcus ducked beneath the blow and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, sending him sprawling backward. The third man hesitated, clearly re-evaluating his approach, but Marcus didn't give him the chance. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a single, precise strike. Within moments, the fight was over. The three men lay on the ground, groaning in pain, while Marcus stood over them, unscathed. He knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The Vipers weren't the type to give up easily, and this was just the opening act. Marcus could feel it in his gut. The real fight was still ahead. As he stood there, his breathing steady and his mind racing, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Not the guards, who were conveniently absent, nor the other inmates, who were locked in their cells. It was something else, something he couldn't quite put into words. And then in the shadows outside his cell, he saw it, a faint glint of light, like the reflection off a pair of glasses. Someone had been watching the entire time. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he focused on the faint glint in the darkness outside his cell. Someone had been watching, but whoever it was had chosen to stay hidden, observing instead of intervening. The tension in the air felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. He glanced down at the three Vipers on the floor. They were in no condition to continue the fight, groaning and clutching at bruises and dislocated limbs. But this wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing from the men on the ground. Marcus's gaze darted back to the shadowy figure beyond the bars, but whoever it was had disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. He thought about calling out, demanding answers, but his instincts told him to hold back. There was something deliberate about the way the figure had watched him. It wasn't fear or hesitation that kept them from stepping forward, it was purpose, and that made Marcus uneasy. As the adrenaline from the fight began to fade, Marcus became acutely aware of the sound of approaching footsteps. This time, it wasn't the subtle shuffle of someone sneaking through the halls. It was heavy, deliberate guards. Marcus stepped back from the downed Vipers, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't holding a weapon. He knew how this would look, and he didn't want to give them any excuse to escalate the situation. The cell block door creaked open, and two guards stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. Officer Daniels was one of them, his expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The other guard, a younger man Marcus didn't recognize, looked more nervous than anything else. Daniel's eyes swept over the scene, the three men on the floor, Marcus standing calmly above them, and his brow furrowed. "Care to explain what happened here?" Daniels asked, his voice steady but with an edge of authority. Marcus kept his tone calm, measured. "Self-defense," he said simply. "They came after me." Daniels's gaze lingered on Marcus for a moment before shifting to the men on the ground. He seemed to weigh his options, as if deciding whether to push further. Finally, he let out a low sigh and motioned to the other guard. "Get these three out of here," he said. "Medical will deal with them." The younger guard hesitated, but eventually stepped forward, helping to hold the injured men out of the cell. Daniels stayed behind, his eyes never leaving Marcus. There was something in his expression, something that suggested he knew there was more to Marcus than met the eye. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice lower this time. "You've got people asking questions about you," he said. "More than usual." Marcus tilted his head slightly, feigning indifference. "I'm sure they are," he said. "This place seems to thrive on rumors." Daniels didn't smile. "These aren't just rumors. I don't know what you did or who you are, but someone on the outside is interested in you. And they're not the kind of people you want to have looking your way." Before Marcus could respond, Daniels turned and left, leaving him alone in the cell once again. The words lingered in Marcus's mind, adding another layer to the growing mystery. Someone on the outside was pulling strings, watching his every move. But who and why? The next day, the tension in the prison had reached a boiling point. Word of the fight had spread quickly, and while most of the inmates kept their distance from Marcus, there were others who seemed emboldened by his actions. A few even approached him cautiously, offering quiet words of respect or subtle nods of approval. It was clear that Marcus had unintentionally upset the balance of power in the prison, and the Vipers were far from happy about it. But it wasn't just the inmates who were paying attention. Marcus noticed subtle changes in the behavior of the guards. They seemed more alert, more watchful, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Even Daniels, who had always maintained a professional distance, seemed to be circling closer, his curiosity about Marcus growing by the day. Then, just as Marcus was beginning to piece things together, everything changed. It happened during the midday yard break, when the prisoners were allowed a brief moment of freedom under the grey sky. Marcus was standing near the edge of the yard, his back to the chain-link fence, when he noticed a commotion near the main gate. A group of guards had gathered, their radios crackling with urgency. At first, Marcus couldn't make out what was happening. But then he saw him, a man in a suit, walking through the gates with a kind of confidence that turned heads. It was the same man who had visited him weeks earlier, the one who had offered help in exchange for something Marcus hadn't been willing to give. The man's presence sent a ripple through the yard, the air thick with tension as every inmate tried to make sense of the situation. The suited man stopped in the middle of the yard, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Marcus. He smiled faintly, a gesture that held no warmth, and began walking toward him. The guards didn't intervene, though it was clear they were uneasy. Marcus stood his ground, his expression unreadable as the man approached. "Marcus," the man said, his voice smooth and practiced. "We meet again." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He studied the man carefully, searching for any clue as to his intentions. "You seem to have a habit of showing up unannounced," he said finally, his tone neutral. The man's smile widened slightly. "And you seem to have a habit of making things interesting." He gestured subtly toward the Vipers, who were watching the exchange from a distance. "Word travels fast in places like this. You've been busy." Marcus didn't take the bait. "What do you want?" The man's expression turned serious, his voice dropping to a lower tone. "I think you know the answer to that. There's a lot happening here, Marcus, more than you realize. And whether you like it or not, you're at the center of it." Before Marcus could respond, the man leaned in closer, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You can't run from who you are. Sooner or later, it'll catch up to you." With that, the man straightened and walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the middle of the yard. The inmates around him buzzed with curiosity, their whispers filling the air like static. Marcus ignored them, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the encounter. The man's words had been cryptic, but there was no denying their weight. Something was coming, something big, and Marcus was running out of time to figure out what it was. Marcus stood in the yard long after the man in the suit disappeared, the cryptic warning playing over and over in his mind. He'd spent years burying his past, locking it away in the darkest corners of his memory. But now, it was clawing its way back to the surface, refusing to stay hidden. Whoever this man was, he knew too much. And if he knew, there was no telling how far that knowledge had spread. Marcus felt the weight of invisible eyes on him, watching his every move, waiting for him to slip. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, his mind racing as he pieced together the events of the past few weeks. The fight with the Vipers, the mysterious note, the man in the suit, it all felt connected, part of a larger web that was closing in around him. He thought about Daniel's warning, about someone on the outside pulling strings. Was this man the one behind it? Or was he just another piece of the puzzle? As the hours ticked by, a plan began to take shape in Marcus's mind. He couldn't wait for the next move to come to him. If he wanted answers, he would have to take action. And that meant stepping into the shadows, where the real power in the prison operated. He thought about the Vipers, about Travis and his enforcers. They were dangerous, yes, but they were also predictable. Marcus had seen their kind before, bullies who thrived on fear and intimidation. But bullies could be manipulated, turned against each other with the right pressure. The following day, Marcus approached Travis in the mess hall. The leader of the Vipers was seated at his usual table, surrounded by his loyal followers. The tension was palpable as Marcus walked up to him, ignoring the hostile glares from the others. Travis looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and suspicion. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Travis said, leaning back in his chair. "But guts only get you so far." Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not here to fight," he said, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I need information, and I think you can help me." The table fell silent, the other Vipers exchanging confused looks. Travis raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You think I'm just going to hand over information to you? After what you did to my guys?" Marcus leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only Travis could hear. "This isn't about you or your crew. It's bigger than that. There's someone on the outside pulling strings, and they're coming for all of us. If you want to keep your operation running, you'll listen to what I have to say." Travis studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Talk." Over the next few minutes, Marcus laid out everything he knew. He told Travis about the man in the suit, about the warning he'd received, and about the growing sense that something was about to explode. To his surprise, Travis didn't laugh or dismiss him. Instead, he listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. When Marcus finished, Travis let out a low whistle. "You're not wrong," he said. "I've been hearing things too. Rumors about a power shift on the outside. Someone new is calling the shots, and they're looking to expand their reach." "Do you know who it is?" Marcus asked. Travis shook his head. "Not yet, but I know where to start looking." That night, Marcus and Travis formed an uneasy alliance. Together, they began piecing together the fragments of information they had, following the trail of whispers and rumors that led deeper into the prison's underbelly. It wasn't long before they uncovered the truth, a smuggling ring operating out of the prison, funneling contraband and information to the outside world. At the center of it all was a name: Blackthorn. Blackthorn wasn't a person, but an alias, a ghost that had haunted the criminal underworld for years. Whoever was behind the name was ruthless, calculating, and utterly untouchable. But what Marcus hadn't expected was how deeply they'd infiltrated the prison. Guards, inmates, even administrative staff. Blackthorn had eyes and ears everywhere. And now it seemed they had their sights set on Marcus. The realization hit Marcus like a freight train. This wasn't just about him. It was about his past, about the things he'd done and the enemies he'd made. Blackthorn wasn't targeting him by chance. They knew who he was, what he was. And they wanted to use him, to turn his skills into a weapon for their own gain. As Marcus and Travis dug deeper, the pieces began to fall into place. The Viper's attack hadn't been random. It had been orchestrated, a test to see how Marcus would respond. The note he'd received was another ploy, designed to push him into action. Every move he'd made had been carefully monitored, manipulated to draw him closer to Blackthorn's web. But Marcus wasn't about to let himself be played. He'd spent years fighting battles on the front lines, outsmarting enemies who were smarter and more dangerous than Blackthorn could ever hope to be. He wasn't a pawn in their game. He was the one who would rewrite the rules. The climax came on a stormy night, the prison shrouded in darkness as thunder rolled overhead. Marcus had uncovered the location of Blackthorn's base of operations, a hidden cell block deep within the prison, accessible only to those who knew the right codes. With Travis and a handful of his most trusted men at his side, Marcus made his move. The final confrontation was fast and brutal, a whirlwind of chaos and violence. Blackthorn's operatives were skilled, but they weren't prepared for Marcus's expertise. He moved like a phantom, his every strike calculated and precise. Travis and his men held their own, keeping the guards and operatives distracted while Marcus pushed deeper into the cell block. When he finally reached the heart of Blackthorn's operation, Marcus was met with one last surprise. Standing in the center of the room, flanked by armed guards, was the man in the suit. He looked calm, almost pleased, as if he'd been expecting Marcus all along. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" The man said, his voice dripping with smug confidence. "You've been a pawn in my game from the start." Marcus's jaw tightened. Not anymore. With a final burst of strength, Marcus dismantled the guards one by one, his movements a blur of efficiency. When the dust settled, the man in the suit was alone, his confidence replaced with fear. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You made one mistake," Marcus said. "You underestimated me." And with that, the reign of Blackthorn came to an end. But as Marcus walked away from the chaos, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The man in the suit had been just another piece of the puzzle. Somewhere out there, the real mastermind was still watching, still waiting. And Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. Marcus stepped out into the night air, the sharp bite of the wind cutting through his exhaustion. Behind him, the remnants of Blackthorn's operation lay in ruins. The silence in the aftermath was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. The prison lights flickered weakly against the storm, their pale glow a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted within. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus allowed himself a moment to breathe. But it wasn't relief he felt, it was the heavy weight of unfinished business. The man in the suit had been taken away by the guards, who arrived just as Marcus was leaving the cell block. Daniels had been among them, his expression unreadable as he watched Marcus emerge from the shadows. There had been no words exchanged, only a nod of understanding. Daniels knew that Marcus had done what no one else could, dismantling a dangerous network from the inside. But Marcus could see it in his eyes. This wasn't the end, not yet. Back in his cell, Marcus sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the wall. His body ached from the fight, but it was his mind that felt the most battered. He couldn't stop thinking about the man in the suit, about his final words. "You've been a pawn in my game from the start." Marcus knew they weren't empty threats. Whoever had been pulling the strings was still out there, still watching. And he wasn't naive enough to think they'd let this go. The days that followed were oddly quiet. The prison returned to its usual rhythm, the inmates falling back into their routines as if nothing had happened. The Vipers, though bruised and battered, stayed out of Marcus's way. Even Travis kept his distance, a newfound respect evident in his cautious nods. Marcus couldn't tell if it was gratitude or fear, but he didn't care. He had no intention of staying in this place any longer than he had to. One evening, Daniels stopped by Marcus's cell. He leaned against the bars, his gaze heavy with unspoken thoughts. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said finally. Marcus looked up, his expression unreadable. "Wasn't my intention." "Maybe not," Daniels said. "But you've got people on the outside asking questions, the kind of people who don't like loose ends." Marcus didn't respond, but the words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Daniels sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's a hearing scheduled for next week," he said. "Your case is being reviewed. With everything that's happened, there's a good chance you'll be out of here soon." Marcus nodded slowly, though he felt no relief. Freedom was within reach, but it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a step into an even bigger battlefield. The hearing came and went in a blur. Marcus sat in the courtroom, his expression stoic as the lawyers and judges debated his fate. Daniels had submitted a report detailing Marcus's role in dismantling Blackphone's operation, and it carried significant weight. When the judge finally announced his decision, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. He was free to go, but the chains of his past still clung to him. As he walked out of the prison gates, the first taste of freedom was bittersweet. The world outside felt unfamiliar, the weight of his choices pressing down on him with every step. A car was waiting for him at the curve, and Marcus hesitated for a moment before approaching it. The driver rolled down the window, revealing a familiar face. "Daniels." "Figured you could use a ride," Daniels said, his tone light but his eyes serious. Marcus climbed into the passenger seat without a word. The drive was silent at first, the hum of the engine the only sound. Finally, Daniels broke the silence. "So what's next for you?" Marcus stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't just walk away from this." Daniels nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "You've got people out there who think you're a threat," he said. "They're not going to stop coming after you." "Let them," Marcus said quietly. "I spent my whole life running from my past. Maybe it's time I stopped." Daniels didn't press further, but his expression softened slightly. "Just be careful," he said. "The people behind Blackthorn, they don't play by the rules. You might have taken out one piece of their operation, but they're far from finished." Marcus knew he was right. The battle with Blackthorn had been a small victory in a much larger war, but he wasn't afraid. He'd faced impossible odds before, and he'd come out the other side stronger. If Blackthorn wanted a fight, he would give them one, but this time he wouldn't be alone. Over the next few months, Marcus began to rebuild his life. He reached out to old contacts, people he could trust from his days in Delta Force. They were hesitant at first, wary of the man who had disappeared without a trace. But as Marcus explained the situation, their hesitation turned to resolve. They knew the stakes, and they knew Marcus wouldn't have come to them if it wasn't important. Together, they began to piece together the larger picture. Blackthorn wasn't just a smuggling operation, it was a global network, with connections to powerful figures in politics, law enforcement, and the military. They operated in the shadows, that influence stretching far beyond what Marcus had initially imagined. But now Marcus had something they didn't, a team of people who were just as skilled and just as determined to bring them down. The final confrontation came on a cold, rainy night in a remote warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Marcus and his team had spent weeks gathering intel, tracking Blackthorn's movements, and planning their attack. The warehouse was their main hub, the heart of their operation. Taking it down would send a clear message. Marcus wasn't a pawn in their game. He was a force to be reckoned with. The mission was fast and efficient, a testament to the team's training and skill. Marcus led the charge, his movements precise and calculated. The guards didn't stand a chance. Within minutes, the team had secured the warehouse. uncovering a treasure trove of evidence that would dismantle Blackphone's operation for good. As the dust settled, Marcus stood in the center of the warehouse, his eyes scanning the room. It wasn't victory he felt, it was determination. This was just the beginning. Blackphone was bigger than one warehouse, bigger than one city. But Marcus wasn't fighting alone anymore, and that made all the difference. In the weeks that followed, the team worked tirelessly to expose Blackphone's network. The evidence they gathered led to arrests and resignations, the ripple effect shaking the foundations of the organization. Marcus watched from the sidelines, knowing that his role in this fight wasn't over. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't running anymore. He was standing his ground, ready to face whatever came next. As he walked through the city one evening, the rain falling softly around him, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace. The scars of his past would always be there, but they no longer defined him. He had found something worth fighting for, something bigger than himself. And no matter what the future held, he knew he was ready. The man in the suit had called him a pawn, a piece to be moved on someone else's board. But Marcus had proven him wrong. He wasn't a pawn. He was the one who changed the game. And as he disappeared into the night, he couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning.